Welcome everybody to this month's AGI Heads and Chairs webinar. Glad to have you. Online today for this webinar is Pranoti Asher, Assistant Director of Grants and Education Programs at AGU, and myself. I'm Christopher Keane, Director of Geoscience Profession Higher Education at AGI. I also like to acknowledge Leila Gonzalez and Luke Carbonell, who at AGI are helping produce this webinar in the background.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So we're really excited to hear a lot of the work that AGI's workforce development team does in helping understand the trends in employment in the geosciences. So I'm really pleased that Chris Keane, who he introduced himself as the Director of Geoscience Profession in Higher Education, is going to be talking about this today. Chris, as many of you know, is a geoscientist by training and has received all his degrees from the University of Maryland. And he is going to share with us what is happening with regards to enrollments and impact on the geosciences. So thank you very much, Chris, and take it away.
Thank you, Pranoti. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about, there's a lot of buzz, obviously, in higher education about the issue of the enrollment cliff. Maybe not a lot of detail about what that actually means, other than the folks in your admissions office losing a lot of sleep. But I've had an opportunity to dive deeper into that issue and also talk about the implications for the geosciences. And wanted to be able to share that, and hopefully we can have a conversation about what you're doing at your school, and as far as new enrollments and recruitment of students, particularly at the undergraduate level. So just a little bit of context real quick. Usually when we're having these conversations, it's a big room full of PhDs, which is the case again here today. And I just want to stress, when we're talking about the student body and the workforce, we're just that little green slot. In fact, there are almost as many folks that have non-geoscience terminal bachelors working in geoscience than there are PhDs with a terminal geo degree. So most of the folks out there are basically working as geoscientists with either terminal bachelors or masters. So keep that in mind as we have this conversation. The students coming through do have a different life trajectory probably than what a lot of our experiences have been. Just in big context, and I know many of you have seen this chart. This is a little bit updated. The employment in the pandemic, the geosciences did pretty well. Right here around start of 2021, we had a drop. This is when the PPP loans, which most geoscience employers had, expired. And folks could right-size their staff, but we rebounded pretty well, and it softened a little bit. A lot of this because, as many of you know, the oil and gas industry, even with their remarkable profits, have not been really hiring that much in the way of geoscientists recently. But we still hear solidly right around 250,000 folks working in the geosciences in the United States. So this just as context. Now, student enrollment is, this is the fresh data, including 2021. We have been seeing a sharp decline now for a better part of 5 or 6 years. The more recent peak around 2015, a lot of that, it was a bit frothy. A lot of it were students coming in, mostly men actually, getting bachelor's degrees, wanting to be able to qualify, go out in the rigs in places like the Bakken and the Marcellus. When that started slowing down, they disappeared very quickly. But we are definitely seeing structural declines in our undergraduate enrollments, and I know many of you probably are experiencing that within your department as well. Certainly, I've talked to plenty that are. Perhaps more concerning is is at the graduate enrollment level. This is the first time in 40 years we've seen a structural drop in our graduate enrollments in the geoscience. We've been bounding around pretty much at a level capacity. We are aware of a number of schools which dropped admissions during the pandemic, so some of that may be a bit of a driver, but we'll have to see over the next couple of years to try to see if this is structural or pandemic driven. When we look up to the most current degrees awarded up through 2021, this is actually a bit more concerning. We've seen a definite steepening in the decline in the number of bachelor's awarded, getting to slopes that look more like the mid-1980s for loss, which is more than just more kids graduating than coming into the programs. This is actually folks that are in mid-progress that are exiting, and that's obviously a very serious concern. But perhaps most interesting is the fact that we've seen a step down there in the master's level. In degrees awarded, again, this is largely driven by softening in the oil and gas sector. But very interestingly, first time ever, we are seeing saw a substantial drop last year in the number of doctorates awarded. I'm pretty convinced right now that this is pandemic driven. Folks that had to delay completing their degree by a year or two. We'll know sometime 2023, 2024 timeframe if this was just a pandemic blip. My guess, it probably is, but we'll just have to wait and see. Okay, so the enrollment cliff is actually, I'll call it a suite of external and internal factors for higher education. Some of it is just pure demographics, but some of it is more on some of the sociology and the economics surrounding higher education and creating some of those challenges. So obviously, we'll talk about the demographics of college age students. This is the one that your admissions office has probably been talking about for the last 10 years. This is not a surprise to anyone. They knew this was coming, but it is definitely a signal that there's a time of austerity ahead, and we'll have to be looking at it. There have been complications from the pandemic, and as we'll talk about, most of that's actually about accelerating changes that were already in place, especially among the culture of the student body that is coming in and is currently in university. The economy obviously has been changing, and we're seeing again a prioritization for obvious pathways to employment. And how clearly that could be conveyed. This is becoming an issue for, do I enroll in higher education or not? And we'll have some discussion about the loan forgiveness program by the administration and some of the negative implications that has ended up having. But I will stress that there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. We see that currently in enrollments. We have departments that are doing fine, and we have others that are really, really struggling. And I think a lot of it has to do about making adjustments to what the new realities are that we'll be facing within higher ed. So the one thing we really can't do a lot about is demographics. And this is perhaps the one of the biggest challenges, and certainly the one at the university level they are very worried about. So perhaps the best way to look at this demographic is sort of to look at the different generations as they're moving through. So we look at the population changes over a 10-year period. So here, you can see obviously where the baby boomers are, Gen X, this is MySpace, the baby bust as they call it. And then, we're coming out of the millennials. They've all just exited school. And there were a lot of them. But now what we're looking at is 25 years of zero to negative growth of college age students. And this is complicated because the millennials, not only there were plenty of students or college age individuals, but there was also a lot of social pressure to go attend college. And I think, as we all know, that isn't quite as much in play today as well. So this is obvious. This is where they're really talking about that enrollment cliff, that there isn't this plethora of potential supply for future students. But the realities are the demographics drive university business models, whether we like it or not. I mean, I think everyone on this call obviously is a huge proponent and fan of the value of higher education. But at the end of the day, the bills have to be paid, and certainly anyone my age, Gen X, you think back to your college days. That was the time when the states really started divesting, in higher education. There were lots of budget cuts. There were losses of departments, losses of, programs, and it was generally an age of austerity, certainly in comparison to what came later. The millennial years, as I said, there was a surplus of students available, both just population-wise and as well as, I'd say social encouragement to attend higher education. And then it was coupled with really easy ability to secure funding for college through debt. So the debt loading process really made it a fire hose of money into the universities. And you saw differences. You saw focuses on experiences and broadening of education's role. This has created all kinds of interesting centers and opportunities on campuses, which I think have lots of value. But what also came with that was swelling budgets and big overhead, and not necessarily in the core academic programs. And I think you could draw a line on the start of the pandemic. It was a different time before that. We're coming out the backside of this really with the new realities of the enrollment and of the business model. So we're in a new world, and it's how well we all adjust and the university shift and program shift within it. And so, of course, then that's also looking ahead, as I mentioned earlier, with at least 25 years of at best no growth, most likely ahead in enrollments. And I'll just add a sort of one of those fast facts. The United States this past year was the first time in its entire history that our population in total did not grow. And so the United States as a country is sort of maturing out demographically, and so that's propagating across all areas. So one of the real challenges is when you start looking at who's going to college, and the good news is it is becoming more diverse. As of 2018, it was 55% were white, but as we all know, the geosciences still struggle in its diversity space. That means that just the fact of the matter is, minus just doing the right thing, we have to find ways to recruit into underrepresented populations in order to even have a reasonable population to recruit new majors from. Now, I was at an academies meeting yesterday, and there were a couple of presenters, and they had some insights. It wasn't directly to this, but it was sort of proximal, and I thought their comments were really, really useful. And one of them talked about, and this was in the case of getting students to engage in looking at careers in raw materials. And, it's the question of promise. Are we able to, show promise for these students in what geoscience does for society, that it's doing something for the better, that it's solving problems, not just identifying them, and that it provides that pathway for a personally fulfilling and, let's face it, lucrative future. And so this is a powerful component to attract students, into basically making a life commitment. It's a hard space when you're 18 years old to, start laying out what your future life actually looks like. And the other one, which was interesting, I think this really plays into the diversity issue, is, if you take away academic research, particularly pure research, geoscience is a socio-technical field. Geoscience is done in the context of society around it, physically, and usually in service to societal issues. It could be hazards, pollution, development, resources, you name it. And one of the problems is we don't actually engage the teaching of the students. We don't even hold the dialogue that we are a socio-technical field. We need to behave this way. And it struck me after 25 years of being involved in various DEI programs that the folks that I've met over the years that I thought they really understood the barrier the geosciences had to engaging broader populations. It always boiled back down to that context, that community context, and how as they venture out, into this profession, does it provide impact to the world that they know? And I think this really boils down to it, and it's an area that I think we need. I personally think that we need to explore as a community, and could be one of those solution pathways as recruiting students becomes more competitive. And when we look at the numbers, great, and just before the pandemic, we finally came to parity with the other STEM fields. So we just went from absolutely awful to just terrible. As you can see, underrepresented population, occupationally is just terrible in STEM. It's still half of the total workforce. But most of that was driven by the fact that we've had great growth in the Hispanic population's engagement in the geosciences, and a lot of that, the specific programs like Geoforce have had a huge impact, but also the fact that we have a lot of world-class geoscience programs at Hispanic serving institutions. This has been a strength point for us, but that's just one dynamic. And so, like, when you look at Black and African American as the Bureau of Labor Statistics frame it, we haven't really made any progress. We're that yellow line, and we have these waves, and we've done some digging, and those waves we're pretty sure are not African American. These are these cadres of geoscientists from Africa that generally the energy industry has rotated through into facilities, into their operations here, domestically, for a couple of years and move on, and it largely follows, rising oil and gas activities. And so I think, there's a real problem here. We're not actually meeting a whole chunk of our population. We still have not solved that, and it's an area we need to be looking at. But I said, we've been historically doing much better recently with the Hispanic population. But when we did the exit survey, prior year, we went from 18% of our bachelor's recipients being of Hispanic heritage to 2% in the middle of the pandemic. Yet the master's and PhD levels didn't budge. And given the pandemic had this outsized impact, particularly on the Hispanic communities, it's hard not to feel that we as a community collectively, every single one of us, had failed this very important emerging population and set of colleagues that we weren't able to find the supports and the structures to keep folks in process to become geoscientists. And we're working on the numbers right now for this immediate past year. I'm hoping for a recovery, and I'm hoping coming out there's recovery, but it is a warning, I think, to us that to solve it, we have to be consistent in how we engage all of the folks that are interested in the geosciences and help them towards success. So, in the diversity issue, how you create the real change, I mean, we need to change the culture of the geosciences, and it's not going to come from intervening underrepresented populations. They're not the issue, we are. And hopefully, if you had a chance to be in the Heads and Chairs webinar last month, we had a chance to see 6, 7, 8 major programs in diversity going on right now that are all focused on changing the culture of the geosciences to actually address these issues. So I'm actually very optimistic, but it's a process we have to do for the whole community. And if you didn't have a chance to attend, I encourage you to watch the recording, to start thinking about how I believe that the geosciences are going to move forward on this, and it's going to be a critical ingredient. So did the pandemic change everything? I mean, we're all tired of the pandemic, and the discussions on it, but it is an inflection point that we're going to be living with. And I think, as we've dug into it, it did, but what it did more than anything is it accelerated what was already happening, and that there's a student culture has abruptly changed. Some of that is example is the NYU circumstance with organic chemistry. We've seen other cases as well, and there seems to be a shift from an approach that the students their approach to education is not sort of the traditional intellectual curiosity and mastery, but actually to intentional learning. I need to learn X so I can do Y and pass that next point and move on down the chain. It's very transactional. Intentional learning is great for continuing education, maybe not so great as you're building your fundamentals. I'm going to just do a pitch. Hopefully, our January, February, we're hope to do a webinar with a person who's been doing a lot of study on this, on the sociology of today's students. Please be looking for that announcement. I will encourage you to make sure all your colleagues attend. He has a lot of great insights and the like on this cultural change, and this is a retention issue. Does the program is the program able to keep engaged, with the population that's in process, but also just coming in? And the other thing is the motivations for higher ed also reflect the economics. You look at Gen X again, and you look at some of the attitudinal surveys. A lot of it was, I'm going to college because I want a job. And that's exactly what you're seeing today. You're providing, the expectations of providing education that is going to lead to employability. Particularly when you look at it that just having a college education isn't making nearly as big of a difference as it maybe did 10 years ago. But now you need a college education that can, deliver in some level of prosperity. And so this is a new motivation. And we see some of this, when we look at our exit survey and the students that graduated about a year ago, in the middle of the pandemic too. And what was interesting, we did not see huge changes in their employment at graduation. These numbers, the dark red and sort of dark orange, these are about normal. Most students don't get a job for about 3 months out. We have not had a real unemployment problem with our graduates. Interesting to see a surge in bachelor's recipient women going on for continuing their education. And if you look, about 25% in most of these cohorts, they're not looking even in geoscience. So they're some of it's disaffection, some of it is they have other drivers that they're leveraging their degree for other applications. So again, at the end of the day, this is what they're looking at is jobs. And further, so if you look at the sort of the early career folks, that we've been studying in the COVID survey, you sort of see that there's this bit of this gravity well about, as we did the longitudinal surveys, this is where they are tending towards, eventually, into the private sector, working as geoscientists. So again, it's down that employment pathway. And likewise, you can sort of see that professional side, just sort of the well keeps filling. The good thing to see during the longitudinal is the unemployed just really, continued to shrink, and there was no big component. So, keep in mind that we can all argue about the education versus training and all those kinds of lovely intellectual debates, but the reality is that's what the students customers are looking for is the employability, which is some combination of a good solid education, but with the ability to do something and be attractive. So the sort of the last component that is we're seeing, and this is exasperating, is what I'll call this unforced fumble by the Biden administration. The loan forgiveness effort was the worst marketing that could have ever happened to higher education. Particularly because loan forgiveness was not coupled with a reform in improving affordability of college, because all it did was signal that higher education isn't worthwhile, because it fundamentally ended up showing to people that, oh, well, there needed to be a federal bailout of the customers. This was no different at base level than someone saying it's like bailing out a bank that's failing. And so when you're looking at populations that we need to build with, like first generation college students, this adds questions. What is that value? It would have been one thing, I think, if this was done. Hey, the financial structure wasn't great, but we're making changes. Probably would have gone a lot farther. So this is has not helped that rhetorical debate that's going on. I expect that it's going to get worse with some of the shifts in Congress about this value proposition. And you're coupling it at the same time with relatively over the last couple decades, relatively high inflation and the return of actual real interest rates. But what does that mean? I mean, there's less cash for tuition by mom and dad or the students that are working, and so this might mean more loans. That again, is it worth the loans? These are economic decisions, and even though the federal government's done a great job at keeping student loan interest rates steady so far, but it's hard to imagine with the interest rates far exceeding the current federal terms that won't be adjusted. And so, and given the fact that easy loans fuel all the higher ed inflation, the fire hose of money that went into higher ed. this is another one of those things that's going to be, sort of a driver for some austerity. So, I mean, I think that the key thing when I look at this, as you're recruiting, as you're talking to students, talking to the parents, you just need to be able to enunciate clearly what the value proposition of your degree is. The cool research and science that you all are doing, I mean, that gets people excited. But in the end, the decisions are now coming down to more dollars and cents. So, how does that then connect out to what that lifestyle, what that, what that occupational opportunity space looks like is going to be really, really key for folks. So it's my email address. Happy to have additional conversations with folks on this. Just wanted to sort of stir the pot and hoping that we can have a conversation. Particularly in understanding, is your department been, say, engaged by the admissions office, for instance, for looking at ways to improve recruitment and retention in order to address this issue? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Right. Thanks, Chris. This was terrific. So I know some questions have already come into the chat, and I'm sure more will come in. But I just thought I would sort of start the conversation. Just a couple of quick questions for you. You mentioned early on that, a lot of the jobs now currently in the geosciences, they're not in the oil industry, right? They're in some sort of professional services sort of sector. Is there, I mean, I know AGI has created these charts where, you can pretty much use the price of gas as a proxy for, figuring out the enrollment in the geosciences. Is there a way to do that now that most of the jobs are going into the professional services? Is that easy to do?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, as I would definitely feel comfortable saying right now that employment in geoscience and oil and gas has decoupled at this point. And so those old models aren't great predictors as far as the jobs, but I do think we're seeing a bit of a response. I don't think the students and the parents coming in have decoupled that in their mind. So I think, some of the negative pressure on enrollment is still this view, well, it's, particularly geology is oil and gas, kind of relationship. I mean, so many of the jobs now are shifting to the professional services sector, and what's happening is, for instance, the energy sector, they're using those groups for what they need for geoscientists rather than hiring on, legions of geologists and geophysicists. Teasing out that in a for a direct relationship, it's a very broad area, and I think it's difficult. I think on the positive side is that it's more flexible, and so I think there will be a good dampening on the boom and bust kind of cycle, because in the professional services sector they can shift between sectors, shift between problem spaces a lot more easily, and so I think that's a positive. But I think some of those models, it's going to take a while for us to figure out exactly how that system responds.
Right. I mean, we have such transferable skills, in the geosciences. So I think that is exactly what you're referring to. My second question, man, I'll pass it on to Leela here in a moment, has to do with, the recent layoffs, in the tech sector. What kind of impact is this going to have on the geosciences, or what do you foresee will be the impact on the geosciences?
I think, I don't think there's a direct, there's not necessarily a direct, I'll say, threat. I think a lot of the, as the former, the founder of Twitter put it, some of the layoffs were his fault because he basically overhired. I mean, he admitted Twitter didn't need 7,500 people. They just had the money that they could. But I do think it calls into question the fact that groups like Microsoft and Google do have, for instance, oil and gas and mining, and they actually have, sectorial divisions that look at these kinds of spaces. And part of their debate has always been, is it easier to teach a data scientist or a computer scientist geology or geophysics, or is it the other way around? Mm-hmm. And the fact that debate even occurs is really disturbing. And I think this goes to, maybe some of the weaker quantitative skills side that the geoscientists bring in, and whether or not that, I think they don't necessarily view the ramp up on those technical skills as being as easy as it is to get someone educated just enough to solve a problem. They don't have to be the expert, and I think that's where the risk space is whether or not, as you have some of these folks coming out of the tech sector, bringing those kinds of skills, if there are other employers that feel that way. And that could be, in essence, a competitor within the marketplace for what might have been positions that would go to geoscientists.
Right, thanks. Leela, I'll let you sort of manage the chat, Q&A from the chat.
Okay, sounds good. We do have a question here from Samantha about, for you, Chris, is there any information or way to find out what institutions are doing to reconnect or support students who might have stopped out due to the pandemic, who could then come back and finish? So have you heard anything from departments, or if anybody else in the chat has anything to share on this, that would be great to hear.
God, I hope someone on the chat has some insights into that, because I think that is the million-dollar question. Tracking folks who leave and anything is hard. And so I don't know, I hope if your program is done, I'm not aware of any, but I think if anyone has programs that have done something like that, I would love to hear about that. And I think everyone else would too.
Thanks. One here from Bernard is a comment about recruiting, and it'd be interesting to hear from you, Chris, if you've heard anything from departments, or if anybody in the chat wants to share more about their recruiting changes. Bernard says that they're looking at moving from passive recruiting, so waiting for the students to show up and declare their major, to actively recruiting students to invite them in. Have you heard anything from departments out there about changes in how they're recruiting students?
I haven't heard people doing systemic changes, but I would say that departments that have historically been proactive like that have had much greater success. We've had some sort of mid-level regional universities that have, even in the drier, the dry spells for majors would be running around with 200 majors because, for instance, one of them actually, had a 1 day per month release time policy. Each faculty member needed to go out and work on recruitment. So the proactive recruitment by every conversation I had works really well. But I haven't heard of anyone. I haven't heard anyone that's been making any substantive changes in that quite yet. And but it sounds like it might be starting to occur. And I think it's the history has said that it's been a very effective kind of approach.
Definitely. And I know on the COVID survey over the last couple of months, we've had some responses about changes to recruiting. So we'll be looking at that and probably putting a currents out on that. People using more social media, being more active in their recruitment strategies. So that's a good point.
So I just add one other thing. So there's two sides of that active recruitment too. So one is the new incoming students. I think if you look at successes of things like GeoForce, for instance, their engagement with parents has been really important. There's been some studies, I'm trying to remember the author, where when they looked at decision influences for students on where they go, parents are like 90% of that influence. But the other side is the in-process students. Physics has never been bashful to say they love geology majors because they all have to take an intro physics course. They can basically filter out the ones that are really high achievers, and they'll recruit them. So there's multiple dimensions to what that recruitment looks like as well.
Absolutely. I got a question here about looking at trends of undergraduates. So what are the trends at undergraduate level of traditional geoscience degrees versus environmental science? Have you been able to pull that out of the enrollments and degree data?
In general, what we're seeing, environmental science, we just don't see those degrees popping out. The degrees come out in the earth science, the geology, the geological sciences, the geoscience kinds of programs. The environmental science programs seem to attract kids, but particularly in those departments that have multiple tracks, the students in the end do seem to come out with quote unquote the harder degree or whatever you want to call it. I think where it gets and we don't track this, but where I think that there is the diversion of actual majors is when you are getting into the environmental study side. And there are programs that have all three, for instance, and the like. So, when we looked at programs and how many are coming out of environmental science and versus the they actually say geology or an earth science degree, the students at the end of the day that are graduating seem to be coming out with a geology or a science degree much more than the environmental science degree.
Great, thank you. And going back to your comment on projections, and Pranoti, this ties back into what you were talking about. Bernard had a question here about, can ASBOG test data and demographics be useful for kind of teasing out projections for enrollments and kind of where things are headed? Have we looked at that?
We haven't looked at the trends on that within. I think that part of the challenge is there's a lot of dynamic changes going on within ASBOG. I mean, I think the number of students taking it is increasing. The accessibility, moving to computerized tests. These are all big things that we're going to see much bigger data sets that are also going to move past just the students that are looking at looking at specific licensure. I mean, I think the other thing which was surprising to me was that the average point at which people are taking the ASBOG fundamentals exam is actually after the master's, not after the bachelor's. And ASBOG has been trying to promote, you should take this immediately after your bachelor's. So I think with the expansion that seems to be underway, my guess is in a couple years, I think there will be lots of good data, lots of insights we can garner from that. But I think it's a little uneven right now.
Great, that's good to know. One question that we have here from Alicia is about going back to your slide on institutional culture. So what is it about the geo-environmental science culture that seems to attract less diverse students in comparison to, say, other disciplines, even within STEM?
Well, I think, I think if you look across STEM, none of them are particularly diverse, particularly if you sort of take on the socioeconomic framing that BLS will do, and they won't count Asian as diverse, for instance. We're particularly not. It's a technical fields issue, and I think it gets back to this whole idea of the socio-technical. If you look at the traditional STEM fields, they all sort of like to sit in isolation. Everyone else is the other. We are in our own little sphere, and we convey information or whatever, versus sort of being part of the community, the society and community in a direct way. I think that's eroding, which is a good thing. I think there's less of that now, and the like. I think some of it, whether anyone likes it or not, environmentalism is actually, and that's a big driver, is a position of privilege. You actually, you actually have to have economic and mental space to really drive that. If it's not something that's directly impacting you, let's say you're on well water that's polluted, then obviously it's very direct. And so I think that's another area where that discourse feels a little bit more abstract from the day to day, even though it shouldn't be.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. We've got a comment and a question actually about going back to kind of the skills space, what you talked about earlier. Thinking about the competition from, say, data scientists getting a little geoscience knowledge, do you see a need for changes in curriculum? There's been this tension between curricula that support certification and licensure, so traditional course names, et cetera, and curricula that teach broader skills such as database skills, statistics, chemical instrumentation. Do we need to be moving towards more, or do we need to be moving more towards the broader skills? What's your insight on that from what you're seeing?
Well, I think it's to me it's actually two sides of the same coin. I agree. One of the problems we have is most of the states' licensure definitions are pretty archaic, and they are tied to course names and stuff like that. If you look at, say, how ASBOG structures their exam, it's actually very much centered around, geoscience related skills. So there's this disconnect. I think that's something the community could do a better job on, is getting states to modernize their licensure component. But I think at the end of the day, particularly employers that aren't beholden to licenses, we had a couple comments, when we were doing the vision and change, the graduate phase of vision and change, and they're saying, the master's and PhD students coming out of school, they're great scientists. They just don't know how to do anything. And so from an employer standpoint, how fast can I get someone up and moving and contributing is a really big issue. That being said, though, there's clear evidence now through the pandemic, as employers have had to rethink what onboarding looks like, that they need to start moving back to investing in employee development, literally going back to, quote unquote, the good old days, of polyester, and people spending 2 years of, having lots of, on the job training, even if they were a master's in geology. So I think this is a space that is changing rapidly. I think the challenge is, the challenge being, licenses only open doors, but the legislation defining those is archaic in most cases. And that's an area that we can definitely, I think as a community we need to be working on. But on the other side, when you crack open anything, you also risk losing it, and I think that's a sensitivity too that's at play.
Get another question here, Chris, about trends of programs combining, such as with geography departments. So, as a strategy, combining departments to increase majors, have you seen any of that happening within the data?
Not recently. There have been a few here and there over the years, but we haven't seen what I'd say is a concerted effort. I've seen administrative mergers, basically where they're trying to reduce the administrative overhead, but not necessarily, combining the programs. But if you do go back, the geography community used to be like us with 700-800 departments back in the 70s, and they sort of had their existential crisis, and as a community, more or less decided to vote half of the departments off the island. But at the same time, that the surviving departments were expected to work over their administration to double the number of faculty positions. The idea was it would be a zero loss for the community, but they would build much stronger, bigger geography programs. And this was at the same time they were realizing things like GIS and remote sensing were going to be bread and butter for them. So, there's an example of it, but, as far as systemic, other than just little here's and there mergers in the geosciences, I have not been seeing it. More just name changes, and whether or not that those are underpinned with program changes or expansions, that's been unclear.
Okay. We've got a lot of great comments and questions in the chat still, so thank you everyone for chiming in. Chris, Stephanie had an interesting comment here. I wonder if you could reflect on or provide some thoughts on. So she said that the just enough education model for companies is having an interesting effect. Here in North Dakota, the oil companies are still hiring, but they're hiring high school grads or peoples with associate degrees and providing the training internally. I've only just learned about this happening, but I'm curious to see how it impacts degree marketing, but also the longer term implications for possibly recruiting non-traditional students. Any insights on that?
Yeah, well, this goes with, just before Amazon and Google and all them decided to lay off everybody, they were all dropping college degrees as a requirement. It just didn't matter. What could you do? I will say, it was interesting in this meeting I was in yesterday. I sort of was I was quite taken aback by one comment that one of the company reps made. They were talking about machine learning and automation opportunities in mining, and they viewed this as an opportunity for diversifying their workforce, in the sense of they wouldn't need someone with nearly as much skill because most of it would be automated. They just needed someone to push the right button at the right time. That is not capacity building. You know, I was sort of floored by that comment. And I think that's sort of the danger side, you know, with this is if the intention on the just-in-time training is again sort of this intentional learning outcome, push this button to make X happen when you see Y. You're not building up the capacity. That's not going to really help things in the long run. When you compare it to things like, you know, when Goldcorp, before they got bought out by Newmont, and they were focused on using machine learning, and a lot of companies do this now to help speed up the data processing, data cleaning, organizing, things like that, so that the expertise, the scientists can spend more time being a scientist and less time, you know, just simply, you know, working numbers. It's a troubling place, but it's a realistic challenge in that question for that particularly that first generation college student that says, oh, I can go work for an oil and gas company. They're going to train me up enough. I'm going to make good money. And Lord, it looks like going to college and taking a loan for that might be a fraudulent exercise. So why should I? And I think that we're getting back to sort of that problem of what the economic return, you know, what on that education is. And I think we have to find a way as a community, all of us, to better explain that and that upward mobility, because I think that part's being lost. It's just the next step. You know, you hired that high school student. Is there a pathway for that student to move forward? American Chemical Society did a similar kind of thing with Chemtechs. Except they built a pathway. And it was so successful, they ran out of Chemtechs because they were all going off getting their bachelor's degree and then their master's degree or going into chemical engineering. You know, it became this big accelerator, which is awesome. You know, but that's a good kind of capacity building in the long run. But you know, this feels like a slippery slope.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, going back to the recruiting space, Katja made a really good point here. Just a plug for those thinking about recruiting, be sure to include your local community colleges in those conversations. And I know there were a couple comments about some departments working with two-year colleges for recruitment. Have we seen any of that in things that you've heard out there with more departments working with, you know, kind of 2-year, 4-year partnerships to recruit students and get them into the educational pathways?
I mean, I hear stuff in passing. I mean, Pranoti, I think you probably have a much tighter beat on that, I would think, with some of your programs.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that. I was just thinking, actually, I'm going to push this back on you folks at AGI. You all did a very nice study several years ago on tracking where students in the state of California, where they were getting their bachelor degrees, what was their path, There were some community colleges that were feeding directly into four-year institutions. And I think you also did this for the state of Texas. Leela, it may have been you who did those
Yes.
and I was just thinking and wondering if you have done that in recent times.
Well, I'll take on that one because yes, that was my work. Fortunately, the benefits about California and also Texas is because they track that at the state level. So that was very easy to do for those two states. I mean, easy relatively speaking. But I seem to remember back when we did that, that was not a universally wide tracking system that all states did. So it was very difficult to do it for more than just those states. But good point. We'll have to take a look at that and see if we can get some updated numbers on that.
I'm wondering if there's anything in the IPEDS data, the NSF data that allows you to do that kind of tracking. Just curious. Not really.
No, not really. So I know for the University of Texas system, they were actually able to track people through the system, which IPEDS doesn't let you do.
Yeah.
They may have that data internally, but not publicly accessible. And even still, I had to work with the state of Texas to get the de-identified data to look at those counts as to where people were going. And then also, you had the exclusion clauses on, if you had less than X number of students, you can't disclose that data and those types of things. So, but something definitely to take a look at. That's a good point. And Chris, I just wanted to throw this back to you because we do have a lot of comments here in the chat about basically looking at environmental science majors versus geology majors. And from a lot of the comments, we're seeing that the environmental science degree has way more majors than the geology degree. So I don't know if you want to take a peek over there at the chat and maybe comment on that and kind of clarify what you were talking about in terms of what you're seeing coming out in terms of geoscience versus environmental science majors.
Yeah, well, but I mean, we're looking at programs that have both, so I can't comment on the environmental science departments. They're doing their own thing. The total numbers coming out in that space nationally are not terribly high. But when you look at the outputs and in the federal data sets, but in the programs that are geology and environmental science, or science and environmental science, and they have separate programs, we've seen that in general the more traditional side has prevailed. That could be biases of the actual departments. We have seen entire departments. I mean, we've seen that for 25 years. Geo departments that then added environmental and then basically blinked out all of their geology, and have evolved out of, into really sort of applied biology programs. So there is a dynamic going on there. But within the universe that we're tracking, majors and degrees don't always end up pulling out at the same point. Within the data collection that we're seeing.
Thanks for the clarification.
Go
ahead. Sorry.
Just thinking about the community college question too. One of the things that was interesting, that I was at the AMS AGI Heads and Chairs meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the meteorology departments were actually talking about the relationships they're trying to build with the community colleges, some for recruitment, but they're not really well tuned into that, but more as a collaboration. So one of their big things was they encouraged their students to do their math courses at the community college, whether before or even while they're in process at the university, because in general they have found the math at the community college is much better teaching, and their students have come out better equipped. For instance. So I think there is a whole universe of different dynamics of those relationships, and when and how that relationship spins up, I think is a question. Like our exit survey, we asked folks, did you attend community college, take some geo courses, but we actually haven't done a good job flushing out, is it in sequence? Did you go to community college first and then on, or you took them during the summer, or you supplemented, or all those other kinds of more ad hoc kinds of engagements. And I think that's a space that, to understand how that relationship sort of works across the universe is something we need to find a way to better understand, because I think it will help on those kinds of questions.
That's a great point. And, something that we've seen in the COVID surveys from departments, I know one of the questions we recently asked was about permanent changes to degree programs. And I remember seeing some departments reporting that they were changing what they allowed for the courses so that they would allow for more substitutions. So it'd be really interesting to see if we see some of that down the road as being able to take courses at other institutions and sub them in for degree requirements, if that has been a positive change that's been come about because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So. Pranoti, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, no, I was just going to close it out. I'm being
Okay.
Sort of conscious of the time here. So thank you. This was great. Chris, we've done other webinars in the past that have been all about how to, recruit students. So I would invite the community to look at other older webinars. Many of much of the sage advice in those is still relevant today. So thank you again for attending. Thank you, Chris, for a great presentation and such a lively conversation. If you're interested, if you know colleagues who are interested in this webinar, want to hear about, listen to this, you'll get a recording. Please share it with your colleagues. And if you're interested in being part of the Heads and Chairs community, please please reach out to me. You can find me at pasher@agu.org. And if you're interested in attending the AGU Heads and Chairs workshop, I think we have about 5 seats left. So if you're interested, please sign up quickly. If you could go to the last slide. Thanks. And if you've missed any of the webinars from earlier this year or from previous seasons, please check them out on AGI's website by searching for webinars. And we hope to be in touch with you next year with an exciting lineup of webinars. Our topic today generated some great conversation and potential, future topics for webinars. So look forward to seeing everyone next year online at these webinars. Thanks, everyone.